It is May 31st, 2024, and U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin talked to his Chinese counterpart in person, face to face in Singapore earlier today. And that's where they exchanged a few words, which included comments from each side on Taiwan. In fact, it seems that all roads lead back to Taiwan, as Washington is constantly warning about Beijing retaking the island which the US itself recognizes as part of China. But they don't really act like it's part of China when you had a bipartisan group of US lawmakers going to visit the island this week, acting like they were sending a message to China. Oh, and the West isn't super happy about the latest reforms passed by Taiwan's government. That's something we've seen a lot of complaining and a lot of criticism about in the US media this week. So I wanted to talk to an expert in the field to go through all of this, to talk about all of the ways in which the US propaganda we are all subjected to is kind of clouding what is actually happening in Taiwan and in Beijing as well. So we covered all of that and much more. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is KJ Noh, a journalist, political analyst, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. KJ, thanks so much for taking the time to join me today.
Pleasure to be with you.
Now, I want to get into the latest here because I know that the defense chiefs of the US and China came face to face in person earlier today in Singapore on the sidelines of a major defense summit there. That's where Lloyd Austin was said to have criticized Chinese military activity near Taiwan, and Beijing's defense minister warned that Washington should not interfere in China's internal affairs. How do you see this exchange? I mean, on one hand, we are seeing in-person dialogue, but it's not leading to any policy changes. And at the same time, it almost seems as if, each side is kind of getting in their talking points and then that's it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much true, Rachel. I think they're talking past each other. The US is essentially telling China, we don't like what you're doing around the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese are saying, this is an internal matter. This is our province. It's part of our country. It's not your business. So I think they really talk past each other. Of course, it's always good when leaders and top officials come together and have a dialogue. But this is the kind of dialogue that is actually not constructive. And I'm afraid that, it gives a false sense of security when actually things are much, much more tense than we understand them to be.
Yeah, and you see those headlines, that talk about these two sides noting that, there is dialogue. And at the same time, both sides did emphasize the importance of keeping military to military ties open, which are set to resume after recent reconciliation. But of course, I know that Beijing is looking at the US, knowing that there are a lot of hawks in Washington who want a hot war with China and are actively pushing to make that a reality. When it comes to this focus on Taiwan, why do you think it is that the US has kind of chosen Taiwan as its route to that, as its proxy, similar to how we've seen the US treat Ukraine?
Well, it's very, very similar to Ukraine in certain ways. But the key thing is, it is China's core interest. It's part of China. And traditionally, when the US has gone to war, or when any naval power, including the United States, has waged war against China, it has always gone through Taiwan. Taiwan is what Douglas MacArthur referred to as an unsinkable aircraft carrier. That's why they prevented the Chinese PRC from reunifying it in 1949. They had to hold on to this little rump state in order to continue to project power. And they were originally hopeful that they would actually roll back the PRC and take over the entire, mainland as well. But that didn't happen. And eventually in 1971, China took over the seat in the United Nations, and then there were three communiques. US normalized relations, and then it recognized China as the only China. This is US policy. They recognized the PRC as the only China, and that Taiwan is part of China. and that it would demilitarize, remove its troops from Taiwan Island. But all of this is being reversed by this administration and previous administrations. And now we are in a world of hot water. We're in a very, very dangerous place, skirting right next to the precipice.
Yeah, and that has got to be the biggest concern because, I mean, whether we get 4 more years of Biden or someone like him, or whether we get 4 more years of Trump or I guess someone like him, we're still headed in the same direction when it comes to China. You don't see anyone really pushing for de escalation. And you also don't see that at the level of Congress, as this week you had a bipartisan group of lawmakers from the US going to Taiwan days after the island's new president took office, carrying what they claimed was a warning for China. Now, how does Beijing see this visit? I mean, I know that it's not Nancy Pelosi who is violating Chinese airspace and the entire world is watching it like it was a couple years ago, but it almost seems like the US has normalized sending these sort of delegations. But is that a violation of the one China policy that Washington claims to respect?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a complete and total violation of the one China policy. It would be as if China sent its top officials to Guam, Hawaii, Texas, or Hawaii to meet with separatist groups and to acknowledge them and to warn the United States government not to interfere in the actions of these separatist movements. It's really, really quite astounding. And of course, we also have to highlight that not only are they sending official delegations or quasi-official delegations, certainly high-level delegations, but they've also been militarizing, they've been sending arms and weapons, and they have been stationing troops inside Taiwan as well as trainers. And so in the Ukraine.
Yeah, and I know that, Beijing sees that obviously they are friends with Russia. They see what's happened in Ukraine and how that has had an impact on Russia. And so they're watching all of this take place. Now, another major story that really made headlines this week was the fact that Taiwan's opposition controlled legislature passed a series of reforms that give lawmakers greater power to control budgets, including notably defense spending. Now, the changes being described as taking power away from the new president, which of course the US does not like that. But how do you see these changes? And is there anything that the West is getting wrong in their reporting on them?
Not to be, too much of a cynic, but I think they get everything wrong on Taiwan. I mean, there are, 5 key lies that they tell about Taiwan. First, that they say that it's an independent state. It's not. It's part of China. Go and look on the US State Department website, or go and look inside the Taiwan Constitution itself. They say they are part of China. So it's not a separate state. The second lie that you're told is that it's some kind of model democracy. And Taiwan and both the United States use this language. They say, it's a model democracy in an area which has no democracy, which is surrounded by hostile enemies, and it has, I mean, this is the language that you hear about Israel. It's very similar, but it is not a model democracy. It's far from it, and it doesn't have the proper separation of powers that you would expect in mature democracy. Essentially, it has what's called a supra-presidential system, where the president has extraordinary power. They appoint the prime minister, they appoint the judiciary, and it's not a tripartite system. It has 5 legislative bodies, which are supposed to be all 5 government bodies that are all supposed to be independent of each other. And one of these bodies is called the Control Yuan. It's like the GAO, the General Accounting Office, which is tasked with oversight and monitoring and even inspection of the executive. Now, that office, which is supposed to be independent, has largely been neutered by the administration. First, they wanted to abolish it, then they wanted to turn it into a PR slash, fluff human rights organization. And then what happened was that the previous president, Tsai Ing-wen, she appointed her chief advisor to head the Control Yuan. This is the audit agency. And so what the opposition party that now control the opposition parties that now control the legislature, they have tried to create a set of checks and balances so that the legislature can actually monitor and audit the executive and even call them as witnesses and do inquiries, etc. And this is being characterized by the Western press and also the DPP, the incumbent party, as some kind of huge violation of democracy. That it's some kind of absurd plan by China to overthrow them. It's ridiculous. But what it is, it's really trying to get the government to conform to international norms on checks and balances.
That is so interesting to me. I love how they're trying to act like, oh, it's, Chinese interference. Like Beijing is forcing them to have checks and balances in their government. This is such a bad thing. They're claiming that that is the case. But yeah, when you're going back to the fact that, and I know when it comes to the way that the US views this, they basically view, oh, well, the DPP is our party. This is who we support. And then anything else is automatically pro China, right? Any other party, even if they're not necessarily wild about Beijing or about their government and the way things run there, then they must automatically be pro China just because they're not what the US wants them to be. And at the same time, we also have seen protests in the streets. Now, whenever you look at these protests, what do you think about them? Do these seem like they are legitimate protests in the streets, or do they kind of go along with that Western outrage and almost just the playbook that we've seen time and time again?
Yeah, they're essentially astroturf protests. They rely essentially on, some hardcore supporters of the DPP. They're strongly influenced by Western media. And behind it all, I would say that, it's strongly influenced by the AIT. The AIT is the de facto American embassy in Taiwan Island. And if you have any, notion that Taiwan is an independent place, all you have to do is go and look at the AIT. It is 16 acres in a very, very small island. They occupy 16 acres. The square footage is 3 times the size of the White House. And essentially, this is where the real decisions regarding Taiwan are made when the US has its quisling DPP party in power, which is the case right now. So the DPP, is a secessionist party. The KMT, the opposition party, and the TPP, another opposition party, they don't want to secede. The DPP does not have the votes to do a real vote or referendum for secession or independence, because the vast majority of people on Taiwan Island want to maintain the status quo. But the DPP wants to trigger a secession because it knows that that is the bright red line with China, and that can be used to provoke some kind of reaction that they could use possibly as a casus belli to start a war. And so this is, the danger that's in. But really, we have the DPP that is the newly elected President William Lai. The vice president, once again, this shows the American influence. The vice president, the current vice president, Louise Hsiao, she used to be an American citizen. Her mother is American. She was born in Japan. She was raised in New Jersey, and then she lived in Manhattan. And then she, conveniently discarded her citizenship so she could run for office. But she's essentially an American person, and they all report to, the AIT And so it really is, kind of an archetypal colonial imperial quisling. It's just a paradigm of what U.S. influence looks like in its para-colonies.
Yeah, and I know that in Washington, they're probably so proud, right? They're like, look at the vice president there, look at what we've accomplished in Taiwan. But on the other side of that, you have the ability to really expose Washington's weaknesses, I would say. I mean, we're seeing that in Ukraine right now. The US went in, they said, this is the government that we support. We're going to overthrow the democratically elected government. And right now, the US is completely being exposed because you have Kiev struggling to stay afloat. You have the US struggling to pass more aid for them. And so when it comes to Taiwan, I mean, you even have reports out now in the Western media. I believe this week there was one article that had a title along the lines of, oh, well, if Beijing wanted to, they could capture Taiwan in under an hour. Well, looking at that as an American, I'm like, okay, that's not my problem. That's not my country's problem, right? This is not our territory. And yet the US acts as if anything that it wants on the other side of the world, that is its territory and its claim. Is there a fear that the US is going to really ramp up its support of Taiwan, its arming Taiwan to the teeth in the coming months as it tries to kind of pick some sort of a battle with Beijing, or even tries to say, okay, what are you going to do in response? And yes, even though the US may be exposed as a result, it still could put us in direct conflict with Beijing.
I think we're very, very close to that point. Blinken and Biden and the CNAS team that is currently running the White House, these are the neocon swamp that, essentially determine what happens to the rest of the planet. They seem very, very much in favor of some kind of kinetic war with China. And they've even given a timeline on it. The General Minahan said 2025. That's when the war starts. Admiral Davidson said 2027. But we know essentially that it's not if the US is going to go to war with China, it's when and how. And so we have these, very clear, pronouncements of timelines. And then we see the massive shaping of the theater of war, the massive shaping of the environment to prepare for war. I mentioned, there are Green Berets on Jinmen Island, Jinmen Island is about 3 miles away from the mainland. It's swimming distance. You have Green Berets placed on right off the coast of China. It would be like the PLA placing troops in Martha's Vineyard or Key West or Galveston Island. It's such a deep provocation. But more than that, the US is preparing not only a massive weaponization, militarization of Taiwan Island, but it's also preparing tactical weapons, tactical nuclear weapons for Taiwan, Tomahawks, submarine-launched ballistic missiles carrying Tomahawks. And of course, it's also bringing in Japan and Korea, to fight, and the Philippines to fight over Taiwan Island or in the South China Sea or on the Korean Peninsula. There's an entire set of mines that have been laid that could go off into an immediate conflagration. And it could be Taiwan or it could be anywhere else along the first island chain. But the fuses are primed and we're in a very, very dangerous situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, as you're laying it out there in my head, I'm thinking, well, the average American, if you were to ask them, do you want to go fight and die in a war against China? They would say no. But as the US is preparing, they're not exactly preparing just for boots on the ground when they're preparing a number of other options to lead up to a potential war. And that has got to be the most frightening thing, I would say, about what they are currently doing. Certainly, a lot at stake here, and I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest. KJ Noh, a journalist, political analyst, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia Pacific region. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. If you want to support my work, you can also check out my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/rachelblevins. That's where you can sign up as a monthly paid subscriber and join the community there. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.